Hello and welcome to the Meaning Project podcast with Dr. Dan. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel A. Franz. As always, thank you for giving me this opportunity to bring a little bit of mental health and meaning to your day. A couple pieces of podcast business, if you will, for those of you who really appreciate the production and sound quality of the Meaning Project podcast with Dr. Dan. Funny story today. You can see if you're watching on YouTube, excuse me, I'm wearing the famed white Amazon or Walmart relatively inexpensive headphones and microphone because just a little while ago I was testing out well, it's not even a new mic, it's an old mic that I've had for a while and I haven't been using. And let me tell you, it sounded wonderful. However, it is harvest time in Farmville, which means there are large, thundering vehicles rumbling around just outside the Meaning Project podcast studios. And with that, the studio hounds, Barley and Daisy, are right above me, absolutely losing their minds and letting those large lumbering vehicles know that this is their studio, that this is their house, and thou shall not pass. So the really nice, high quality sound mic picked up every vocalization of Barley and Daisy. And I didn't think you wanted to hear that, although maybe you do. And if you do, feel free to come on by. We can schedule a time anytime you like. But so back to the inexpensive, hopefully wonderfully quality enough headset. But after these past few weeks, a lot of good interviews, some good conversations. We had Rabbi B and Raina and Tom. No, Tom's coming up. He'll be next week. Matt Nostalgia. A lot of fun interviews and great conversations. I hope you have enjoyed those. But I tell you what, honestly, I've kind of been looking forward to getting back to just me and you, just having a nice little chat together. Actually, I'll do the chatting, you listen. But as always, if you would like to contact me and engage in that discussion, you're welcome to find me at danielafranz.com. You know that's Daniel. I almost forgot how to spell my name. DanielAfranz.com. So why have I been looking forward to getting back to just you and I chatting for a little bit? As you have heard on past podcasts, this is kind of a summation of a few of the podcasts. I am diving into Viktor E. Frankl's logotherapy and existential analysis theory and practice by Doctors Maria and Edward Marshall. Look at that. If you're on YouTube, look at the size of that book. My goodness, it is quite ginormous and it is awesome. I mean, they wrote this intentionally as a text for those studying logotherapy. So I wanted to dive into one of the particular areas. So I'm going to read to you a bit today. I hope you don't mind. And the goal of this, as I read this the first, second, third, or fourth time, it really demystifies in some ways the process of logotherapy, not the process of counseling, but specifically counseling using logotherapy. But in this initial phase, it also talks quite a bit about diagnostics. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know my opinion on diagnostics and diagnoses, the frustrations it causes, but especially today, how, look, it is human nature to label things so that we can understand them. We need to apply labels so that we have a better understanding of things. But when we reduce a human being and all of their experience to a label such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, or my favorite, and you know this, narcissist, we reduce the entirety of that person to that one label, thereby assuming or thinking we know everything about them. And that is very, very dangerous in our culture, especially for the untrained professional. When I hear the word narcissist, it brings about an entire 10 pages from this book right here, the former Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, revised version 4, which we'll be talking about here today. That word means a whole bunch to a trained professional, but in our world today, we throw out narcissist or depressed or anxious. And we think we know what that means. But again, we're reducing either ourselves or the people we're talking about to this label. And it can't be healthy all the time. As you've heard me say before, I don't think many of you, many of us, are anxious or depressed. However, we are trying to understand a difficult situation, a difficult time, and our reactions to it, where we might feel worrisome. We might experience physiological symptoms. It might be hard to get out of bed some days. Yes, these are all symptoms of depression or anxiety or a variety of other mental health issues. Excuse me, actual mental illnesses. But that doesn't mean you're mentally ill. As the good Dr. Frankel says, an abnormal reaction in an abnormal situation is completely normal. And we are dealing with more and more abnormal situations in our times, and it's okay to react a little oddly. But it's important to recognize that and maybe not label yourself, but to come to a better understanding. So if you will, allow me this, oh man, this section of the book is just so good. It talks about the process, right? The process of a logotherapeutic intervention, which, you know, as you know, being a listener, it follows an existential conceptualization during which we form a holistic case study of the individual, right? Holistic, trying to understand the entire person and not reduce them to a label. By doing this, we go through the diagnostic phase and the treatment phase and the follow-up phase. In logotherapy, our case formulation, the way we go about diagnoses, the goal is, and here's some inside baseball, if you will, inside the therapist's mind. During the diagnostic phase, which can usually be a few sessions, in my opinion, certainly, obviously, the first session where we meet, our goal, the therapist's goal, is to gain a broader insight into the patient's background and present concerns. So let's take, for an example, a 40-year-old individual walks into my office, and my goal in that first hour is to come to some kind of somewhat complete understanding of their background, their history, and their current concerns. Why are they here? My favorite question, anybody that walks into my office, my first question is, how can I help you today? Because first of all, the goal is, if you had the courage to come into my clinical office or to call me for a coaching session, first of all, again, I don't take that lightly. That is a courageous move. But I want to make sure within that first hour, that first meeting, you walk away with something to help you feel better, but then also gain enough information that I can formulate successive future treatment opportunities to help more, right? So I love this part. They, the therapist, may ask structured questions that help them to cover a range of areas that can be relevant to the understanding of the patient, of the client. And it's kind of funny. I've been doing this for a long time. I throw out the number 25. I haven't done the math yet, but probably 25 years now. And I'll never forget, my early years, that first session, hell, I didn't think I knew what I was doing. It helped, but we can get into that some other time, why that helps. But in the early days, right, out of grad school, every place I would work had a intake packet, pages of structured questions. And I'm almost embarrassed to say it now, but I mean, we would sit there, one-on-one with another individual, and I would look at this page and ask them a question and write in the line, and ask them a question, write in the line. Like, how dehumanizing. For all of you that saw me in those initial years, I am so sorry. But I think many of us, if you've done any kind of therapy, have run into therapists that still do that, and it's okay. But I think with experience, we should, as professionals, all learn. I know for me, I just, those questions come naturally, and they follow a natural line and progression rather than some piece of paper that seems really kind of wonky. Obviously, some information may be already available through different referral sources, intake paperwork, things like that, right? So we try to get all of that information. We may follow a structured or semi-structured, I'm definitely semi-structured and completely unstructured sometimes, format to gather information about physical, psychological, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And of course, if you've heard my kind of talk about the 6 pillars of wellness or health, it's mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, vocational, right? Work life is a big part of our situation, and relational. What are our most intimate relationships like? Is the individual married? Are they dating? Family issues, things like that. This is all the information we'd like to try to get a complete picture of in that initial session, but if not in the initial, of course, in subsequent sessions. So that's a little bit of the pulling the curtain back and demystifying that initial session. From there, we go into the idea of diagnostics. I'm sorry, I am completely distracted. I hopefully it's not coming through the mic, but I tell you what, the studio hounds, as they will now be known, are just losing it upstairs, and I'm debating whether or not to hit the pause button on both. See, here at the Meeting Project podcast, you may not know this, but I am not only the speaker and host of the show, but also the producer, janitor, and every other role possible. So looking at this screen and trying to figure out the video recording, the audio, there's a lot going on. So I'm sorry if I'm distracted and trying to figure out whether we need to pause this or not. Let's continue. This is the fun thing when it's just you and me, right? I get to go on these interesting tangents, and Rabbi B is not there to rein me in. I'm so sorry. So back to the diagnoses, the diagnostic manual for you watching on YouTube. You can see back there, it is this here red book, DSM-4, which was good all the way from my beginning of grad school for me through, it says here, 2013, when we had the much maligned and heavily debated DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, written by the American Psychiatric Association, revised, updated DSM-5 2013, and which coincides with the International Classification of Diseases for Mortality and Morbidity Statistics, what is commonly known as the ICD, which when I started out, we were on ICD-9. Apparently today, as of 2018, the World Health Organization has released ICD-11, 2018. Both are based on neuroscientific findings and research in genetics, right? So I think we all know in the past 20 years, our ability to conduct research has expanded with fMRIs, functional MRIs, brain imaging, different ways we can do scans and things like that. It's really been amazing. So these new findings and insights have affected case conceptualization in psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy. As a school of psychotherapy, the practice of our logotherapy and existential analysis has certainly been influenced by these changes. All right, folks, I'm going to make a really wonky pause here. So hopefully you don't hear anything or see anything in the YouTube, but I'm going to pause both, try to resume both at the same time, and get back into this. Okay. See, you didn't miss much in that time lapse. But for me, sorry, I almost have to catch my breath because what I was hearing above the studio here was the big old dog, Barley, barking quite profusely. I could hear that deep bark. And baby Daisy, the puppy, that voice was really, her bark seemed kind of distant, as though maybe she found her way upside. No, she found her way upstairs into my wife's office so that she could get a better view of the big lumbering vehicles and really yell at them even more profusely. So sometimes you just pick the wrong time to record a podcast, but you know what? It's got to be done. So here we are talking about diagnostics and demystifying the process of logotherapy, right? So we're talking about the change from DSM-4 to DSM-5. And the first and most important change, and I love this part, right? The origin of mental disorders, mental illness, can no longer be attributed to specific causes. Back in DSM-4, we thought we knew enough to be able to provide causation to mental health issues. And we realized through continued research, as they say here, it is no longer tenable to draw a sharp distinction between mental disorders that are caused exclusively by neurobiological facts, what's inside us, or exclusively due to psychological factors. It's a combination. We know that more and more. So often people will come into my office, whether it's for mental illness or even for different kinds of coaching. And maybe that's a podcast later to draw the distinction between them. Wanting to know the reason, right? As again, human nature is to want to understand why. And quite honestly, it is a professional delight. It is a joy. It is fun for me to help a person walk through the whys, the potential whys, but rarely, again, taking that 40-year-old individual case example, I mean, there's a lot that goes into being 40. A lot of time, experience, biology, physiology, environmental factors that I think it's kind of silly of us to think we can come up with one why. And that's, I think that's my draw to logotherapy, right? Logotherapy, as we talk about, very different from psychoanalysis and other schools of psychology. You know, Dr. Freud, sit down, lay on the couch, and tell me about your mother. I actually used that in the session today. Freud wanted to go deep into the past, thinking uncovering the past would solve the present. And logotherapy says, you know, we don't have to. We can if you want to. We can explore some of the past, but let's talk about the changes you can make today in order to make the future better. It's recognized that the genesis of any mental disorder depends on multiple factors. We talk about genetic predispositions interact with epigenetic factors, right? External influences. And, right, so we've got genetic predisposition, nature, what's inside you, what genes your parents pass on, with external influences, the environment, how you were fed as a child and raised, and what you eat, and of course prenatal factors, what's going on in the womb, as well as postnatal trauma and attachment experiences. We know those first few years of life, attachment is very important. All of this can affect how genes are expressed. You may have a gene for a particular issue or mental illness, but it may never be expressed, right? Harmful experiences lead to the demethylations of DNA sections that are then switched off, causing the expression to be lost, right? This leads to a reduction of the margin within which behavioral changes are possible for a person. That's from Dr. Elizabeth Lucas, right? We know that genetics can be altered and damages to DNA and sections cannot be undone, right? So some of these things genetically, you can't change it. You can't change your genes. You lose it, or you can't fix it. However, we know there is remarkable plasticity of the neurobiological system in which new synapses can be formed and the interconnectivity of neurons can be altered, right? So remember for those of you of a certain age, similar to mine, you remember the old story that the public service announcement, this is your brain on drugs, and it was a frying pan. They'd crack an egg, put it in the frying pan, it would sizzle. And that was meant to scare you away from using drugs. But it was also meant to suggest that if you harm your brain, or if your brain is harmed, right? You remember the story that, well, for every time you drink alcohol, you're killing brain cells that will never come back. Okay, so fact is, you probably are killing brain cells, certain drugs, certain substances, banging your head into somebody else's head in a variety of sports, right? This damages your brain. It may kill brain cells, it may harm neurons, but we know that now they can be grown back. We can engage in activities and behavior in medicine that new synapses can be formed, and we can reconnect or newly connect different parts of the brain in the way to honestly improve functioning, right? To change what once was. New structures can take over and compensate for the structures that were lost. Excuse me. This capacity is most accelerated during sensitive times in childhood, but present throughout adulthood and late adulthood, right? So those critical times in childhood, those are the times of accelerated brain development that we want to nurture children and help that attachment and make sure they're getting good nutrition. Those are those critical times. And sometimes when we miss the opportunity to develop in a healthy way during those times, they may be lost. But as we know, even in adulthood and into late adulthood, we still have the capacity to change, to learn, to grow, to alter our neurobiological structure. This means that, you see this, a big fan of this statement here, through psychological interventions, synapses can be altered, and new connections can be formed. This is the psychological basis of psychotherapeutic interventions. That's why having a therapist, having a coach, having a mentor, somebody trained to help you through these things. Truly, people wonder why does counseling work? What's the benefit to it? Why does coaching work? When you talk about these things and you engage in the right psychological intervention, you are truly growing your brain. You are impacting your neurology, your brain, your physiology in a way that improves your functioning. All right, so that's pulling the curtain back again on counseling, therapy, coaching, whatever you want to call it. The benefits go right directly to your brain to improve brain functioning. But then, of course, that improves emotional processing, behavioral outcomes. It can improve all those 6 pillars I talk around, right? Mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, relational, and vocational. So the next change to the DSM, right? The first change, we recognize that we do not have one causal factor that causes mental health concerns, right? The second change is that traditional distinctions, and I think you've heard me use these phrases before, like neuroses and psychoses, are abandoned, right? So it's not one word that you're just ill, you have a neurosis or a psychosis, but they're abandoned for considering a spectrum of severity. We recognize that one word diagnoses just aren't functional, right? People experience mental health issues, mental illnesses in a variety of ways. So many of our diagnostics are now on kind of a spectrum. Many of you have probably heard that when it comes to autism. Autism is certainly a spectrum. Well, so is depression and anxiety. So are many of those concerns we talk about. The more, let's see where we are. Considering that severe episode of formula anxiety disorders, the criterion that more an individual's thinking manifests breaks from reality in combination with the severity. So what this is suggesting, sorry, I just muddled through that. The idea that you can have a mild case of depression, a severe case of depression, and anywhere in between, anxiety, any one of these things. But the further along it is on the spectrum, mild depression, right, just a general malaise, may not require psychopharmacology, may not require medication. I'm sure you've heard in my opinion, many times it doesn't, and for a variety of reasons. However, when we reach a more severe state, often with psychotic symptoms, psychotic meaning kind of a break from reality, experiencing things that aren't there, yeah, that certainly requires medication. All that to say, for many of us, for most of us, feeling the anxiety or depression of our modern times does not require medication. Quite honestly, again, this is my opinion, but that of many professionals as well, medication is contraindicated. It's no good in a lot of these situations because, quite honestly, we don't know the long-term effects of serotonin reuptake inhibitors and having extra bouts of serotonin in your brain. We're not always sure. You want me to pull back the curtain? Watch out, because I think this might surprise you. Most people don't recognize when I ask them what kind of prescription they're on, and they tell me, and I go through and okay, yeah, it does this and does that, and well, it was originally, some people want to know how, and the sad and crazy thing is most of the time we don't know. Many of our mood stabilizing medications today were created for entirely different reasons. Often, many of them back in the day were anti-seizure medications. We now use oh my goodness, what are we using now? Antihistamine, Benadryl, for anxiety. Why? Because we found out that the family of benzodiazepines is so terrible for us. If you're on Xanax or Valium or Ativan, if your doctor is just throwing those out casually, please make sure you are working with a therapist to help you get off of that. Long-term use of this anti-anxiety family of drugs can be so harmful. It is better for you just to take a simple Benadryl. First of all, you won't be allergic to hay fever or bee stings at that point, but also it's going to calm you down in much more healthy and natural ways, right? So 2 changes from DSM-4 to DSM-5. We went from neuroses and psychoses to a spectrum, and then also recognizing that the origin is not of one cause. Um, this next part is so good and unique to logotherapy. With respect to classification of mental health issues in logotherapy terms, we talk about a strictly somatogenic, love these words, I'll break them down, somatogenic, psychogenic, or neurogenic, right? Somatogenic originating from the body, soma, psychogenic originating from the mind, psyche, and neurogenic, right? Noetic, nuos, spirit, right? So is it physical, is it mental, or is it spiritual? And that used to be unheard of in the diagnostic criteria in mental health practices. Now it's understood that the complexity of all 3 dimensions, person as a mind, body, and spirit, these 3 areas interact to affect the individual, right? So it goes back to the 6 pillars: mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, vocational, and relational. Right. So it says here, somatogenic implies a focus of causation seated mainly in the body, in the somatic plane, with medical intervention, right? If I was working with an individual the other day, struggling because couldn't determine if it was related to stress or some kind of physiological cause like low testosterone, obviously a male. If we know something originates in the body, I think anxiety due to heart arrhythmia is a perfect example, right? If you're experiencing bouts of heart arrhythmia throughout the day, that can be anxiety inducing. But you may think it's just anxiety when all of a sudden you go to see a doctor and then a cardiologist, and they're like, oh, there's an arrhythmia there that's really throwing you off. And yeah, you might experience that as anxiety. That's a prime example, right? No amount of medication is going to stop that. And quite honestly, psychological intervention can have some application, but if we know it's in the body, we treat the body and it works, everything starts working better. And that's where medical intervention comes in. When the term psychogenic is understood as conditions with a focus on psychological origins, they meet the diagnostic criteria for which psychological interventions are indicated. That's when we go to our DSM and we recognize, I think PTSD is a great example. If you're experiencing 7 out of 12 of these criteria, you are on the spectrum of PTSD, and we know what the protocol is to help somebody with that. If you're struggling sleeping, having flashbacks, nightmares, general symptoms of depression and anxiety, and obviously you experience some kind of traumatic event in your life, yes, then you need a psychological intervention related to PTSD. Logotherapy can be helpful in finding meaning in that suffering, but to truly conquer the PTSD, you go to one of my good friends and have what's called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. That goes back a few episodes when we talked about it. You have that treatment, the PTSD gets better. If you want to do logotherapy, you associate it with meaning, right? So we have physiological somatogenic issues that are treated by medical professionals, psychogenic issues that are treated with, very often with psychological cures, maybe some psychopharmacology. And then the area of logotherapy that we specialize in the most, it's the neurogenic conditions, right? The illnesses of the spirit, of the conscious, of so much more agendas to other areas, right? The suffering of a person in their everyday life. Oh my God, you guys, how much have we dealt with this in the past few years, right? Neurogenic conditions have a focal point in the dimension of the spirit, where the suffering of a person in their everyday life is manifested in existential experiences that can be accompanied by psychological and physical correlates. So let's break that down. I know I go back to the events of the past few years often, but when we're locked down away from family and productive work, or away from friends, maybe, with our family a little too much, and away from productive work, and we're inundated with negative information on a daily basis, that's spiritual. That affects our conscience. That affects our consciousness. Sorry, not our conscience. Maybe even our conscience, but our consciousness. It affects our existential beliefs about who we are and where we're going and what the world is about. That is certainly neurogenic, but it can be manifested physically or psychologically. As we were going through those times, um, many people became ill, not from COVID-19, but just the stress of being through the lockdown, both psychologically and physically. Right? In these instances, logotherapy can be specifically applied along with other forms of psychological interventions or even psychopharmacology, a physiological pill. um, During that time, though, medication does not take a primary focus. That that is the thing I think bothers me the most in my office and my clinical or coaching practices, that we often find ourselves in a physician's office because we're struggling with something psychological or spiritual, neurogenic. And what's a physician going to do but prescribe medication? It is what they know to do and they want to be able to help, but it doesn't always help. Um, Pills may help temporarily, but the best part is, as it says here, interdisciplinary assessment to differentiate cause and reasons and to establish the focus of the intervention corresponding to the focuses of the reading, right? To truly come to an understanding of which of all those potential causes we listed um, are bringing about this situation. And that's the power of logotherapy, is taking the time to understand all the potential causes. Sometimes a purely psychological approach, somebody that has studied psychology or just counseling psychology, can be extremely beneficial, but not to toot our horns or my own horn. But the idea of understanding that spiritual dimension, that other dimension of human beings, can be so much more helpful. So let's toot logotherapy's horn for a minute here. Logotherapy was specifically developed for the treatment of conditions which do not get diagnosed as mental disorders. And my friends, I can tell you, most of the people that end up in my office or on my screen or in my coaching are not mentally ill. They are not diagnosable. However, diagnoses need to be applied for people that want to use insurance money, and that can sometimes be a frustration, but that's a whole other podcast in itself, right? Logotherapy was specifically developed for the treatment of conditions which do not get diagnosed as mental disorders and which have existential issues as their primary component. Here's some examples. You'll love these, right? Such as losing trust, losing confidence, losing a sense of purpose and meaning in life, right? These conditions are not mental disorders, but many of us today are struggling with that. Losing trust. So many cases of relational infidelity or betrayal, and infidelity not meaning just sexual, but sometimes emotional, sometimes social media, even financial betrayal or infidelity in a relationship can rock somebody's world, right? That's not a mental disorder, but it certainly requires some assistance, some guidance. If you're going through that by yourself thinking I can handle it on my own, it's going to get kind of difficult. Losing trust. How many of us lost trust maybe in the world? We can say in the world, but maybe there were specific causes that we lost trust through the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns, just not knowing where to turn when we have so many disparate opinions being thrown around and anger happening so often. Yeah, it can be easy to lose trust, and there are ways to regain it. Losing a sense of purpose. I can tell you, it saddens me, but it excites me how many young people, young adults I'm seeing right now. So much so that there's a good chance we'll be doing some online group work in the future. Actually, I'll tell you about something we have coming up, but so many young adults struggling after all of the changes. And look, I'm not going to demonize the pandemic, but what it did to our education system in the United States, and I'm sure worldwide, has devastated many young people's sense of purpose and meaning and where they want to go and do with their lives. My daughter was a high school senior during that time, did not have a high school, barely had a high school graduation or all those things that mark the ending of high school and the transition into a different phase of life. And that's caused some difficulties for her. It really has. I work with a lot of young adults who are struggling just to find that sense of purpose and where do I want to go and what do I want to be in life, whether in college or in the workforce right now. It's really difficult. That's the sad part. The great part is the part that I love, they're asking for help. They're either coming to their parents and asking for help or they're just seeking me out on their own. And it's so much fun to work with them. Unfortunately, as you've heard me say before, just like you, I only have so many hours in my day, and I'm not able always to see all those people I want to help. Hopefully, as I said, next year through the power of the internet, I'll be able to do a little bit more, but that's coming next year. This year, in a couple weeks, I'll tell you more about that in future podcasts. I will be speaking to a group in Canada focused on helping young people. So we'll get some links to that set up either on the website or through the podcast. That's going to be really cool. These conditions are not mental disorders. They are conditions that are of clinical focus and interest. That really sums up the highlights there. You really don't want to go into the chapter on the initial dialogue or what we say in our first session. If you want to do that, give me a call and schedule a session. You know I'd be happy to chat with you. Again, if this is something you're interested in, here is the book. Grab you some Viktor E. Frankl's Logotherapy and Existential Analysis Theory and Practice by Doctors Maria and Edward Marshall, or just keep coming back here and checking into the Meaning Project podcast. You know, if you can see on the YouTube or if you're just listening there, look at all those tabs I have in there. There are so many sticky notes and underlines that I can't wait to continue to share with you. I hope you found this as meaningful as I did. I feel like it's kind of like when Rabbi B and I chat, we just come up with a topic and go. However, without him to kind of restrain my excitement for this topic, I may have a tendency to go in a lot of different directions. So hopefully you found that insightful, meaningful, possibly even enjoyable. If you did, help me out. Send it to some other people. Share, comment, like, whatever podcast platform you listen on. Click that little button, give it a thumbs up so that the magical algorithm shares this with more people. Because if you found it helpful, well, I hope other people do too. Because as you know, that's what brings meaning to my life, is helping you and others find meaning in your life. And like I've shared with you before, if you like this podcast enough to wear the t-shirt, sweatshirt, drink out of the pint glass or cup. Oh my goodness, I did not have my Meaning Project cup today. All the links are there. Hop on the Patreon page, take a look at the merch store. And I've been receiving a lot of really good feedback, helping some people in South America find logotherapy. Look, if you're in South America and you want to do some logotherapy with me, give me a call. The problem is you're going to have to speak English because unfortunately I am terrible at Spanish, but I'm helping some individuals down there find some Spanish-speaking logotherapists. I certainly have a great network of friends that I've met through different logotherapy institutes. If that's something you'd like to do, you are welcome to find me at danielafranz.com, DANIELAFRANZ.com. Thanks for listening. I appreciate you letting me bring a little bit of mental health and meaning into your day. Take care.